On June 12, 1942, a young girl received a diary for her 13th birthday. The gift was given during one of the most turbulent and bloody chapters in modern history. Just a decade before, a terrifying force had been unleashed in Germany. The Nazi Party, led by Adolf Hitler, took power and began to systematically persecute the German Jewish population.
It was really very scary to go out in the street to do your shopping, and many, many people disappeared. Many, many were arrested.
Forced emigration, imprisonment and murder were becoming daily threats for Jews. And as World War II broke out and Hitler gained more and more territory in Europe, those Jews who fled persecution found themselves under threat once again, unable to escape.
After several weeks and months, the measures against the Jewish population started to bite.
She was not allowed to go into parks, she was not allowed to go to the movies, she was not allowed to use public transport, which was a very visible measure also in terms of the persecution of the Jews.
The girl in receipt of the diary was Anne Frank, a young German Jew who had fled with her family from Frankfurt in 1933, but now found herself trapped in occupied Amsterdam.
For some, she is a victim. For some, she is a source of inspiration. For some, she is a brilliant writer.
As she put pen to paper to record her experience, she could never have envisaged that it would lead to one of the most well-known works of literature the world has ever seen.
People said, well, who is interested in a diary of a young girl?
Nor could she have realized that it would also be the document to a harrowing and ultimately tragic story of persecution inflicted on a child who would become the symbol of millions of others.
It's a remarkable fact that a book has been able to inspire so many people in so many different ways.
Through her, of course, the world is learning about what has happened.
The story of Eva Schloss, also an immigrant to Amsterdam, would run in parallel to that of Anne Frank. She could not have imagined, however, how inextricably their lives would be linked.
One day, a little girl came to me and introduced herself, and she said it was Anne Frank.
Separately, Eva and Anne would spend 2 years hiding from the constant threat of the Nazis. These two young girls would share similar experiences, but their lives would have very different outcomes.
There are 1.5 million children murdered, but if you talk about that, people can't imagine. So Anne has become the symbol for all those 1.5 million victims.
Eva survived to tell her story, but the legacy Anne Frank left would end up having a global impact.
In the Holocaust, Anne has become the most important victim, actually.
Anne was born to a German Jewish family. Her father's family had lived in Frankfurt for 7 generations. They were very culturalized. They were very settled in Frankfurt. Her mother was Edith Hollander, also from a Jewish family. Anne's father was Otto Frank, 7th generation German Jew, who had actually fought in the First World War and been decorated with the Iron Cross. 3 years before Anne was born, her sister Margot was born. Anne was born on the 12th of June, 1929. She was a pretty normal girl growing up in a German family. The lives were very much like kids live their lives today, playing in the street, going to birthday parties, a very normal childhood.
In 1933, the Nazi Party seized power in Germany. Hitler's anti-Semitism meant that Jewish persecution was implemented immediately. and the very normal childhood experienced by Anne and thousands of other Jewish children in Germany would be changed forever.
She came with a family to the Netherlands in the beginning of 1934.
The Nuremberg laws were introduced, and life became increasingly difficult for German Jewish families.
All books of Jewish authors are ordered burned in the public squares. Authors, scientists, artists are driven from Germany. 1,600 have fled to Holland, 12,000 to France, 1,200 to Spain, 3,000 to Czechoslovakia.
The Franks chose to move to Holland, and in 1934 arrived in Amsterdam.
Otto knew people in the city and went originally himself to see if he could find work, start a business, which he did.
Anne and Margot both enrolled in Dutch schools and both seemed to adapt well to life in Amsterdam.
Basically, she was raised as a Dutch girl in the 30s, went to school. She was fond of reading. She read a lot of books.
She was actually quite precocious, though, for a 13-year-old, and quite self-absorbed. She was the chatterbox in the class and always getting into trouble with the teacher.
The family quickly settled into their new surroundings. The Netherlands became their home, and a normal life could once again be resumed. Throughout the 1930s, Hitler made several territory gains in Europe, one being the Anschluss in Austria in 1938. Eva Schloss, a child living in Vienna at the time, found herself having to move.
I was born in Vienna in 1929, and I had an older brother who was 3 years older than me. We were a very happy family there, and all this ended up abruptly when the Nazis came in, and we were lucky enough to be able to get out in time.
They first fled to Belgium before finally settling in Amsterdam, another Jewish family fleeing from persecution.
Amsterdam was a lovely city. The people were very welcoming to refugees. I went back to school, I got a bicycle, we were together again as a family, and it looked as if life was going to get back to some kind of normality.
The years in Amsterdam before 1940 were very peaceful, very normal, and they felt that they had found a haven of safety from the Nazis.
We moved onto the Merwedeplein, a modern square in Amsterdam. Well, it was actually more a triangle where apartments were on both sides, and there was a big open space where all the local children came to play after school. And one day a little girl came to me and introduced herself, and she said it was Anne Frank. We were 11 when we met. I was more a tomboy. I liked to play with the boys and as well tricks on the bicycle. And Anne was more a sophisticated little girl, interested in her clothes, in hairstyles, in film stars, and as well in boys already. She said her family comes from Germany, and I couldn't speak much Dutch yet, so she took me up to her apartment and I met her family.
During this meeting between Eva and Anne on the square of the Merwedeplein, neither would be able to comprehend how their lives were going to be intertwined and their idyllic life in Amsterdam would soon be turned upside down.
They chose Amsterdam because in the First World War, Holland was neutral, and they felt that there would be a refuge for Jewish people in Holland.
Unfortunately, in May 1940, the Germans invaded that country as well.
Towns and villages were in flames as the invaders rolled on at a breathless pace, encircling the defenders and slashing their armies, destroying in the name of the new order the homes and shops of those who had dared to resist. The Nazi machine broke the back of Dutch resistance in 4 days.
After the occupation of the Netherlands in May 1940, Life seemed to stay pretty normal and pretty much the same as before.
Life continued, but I must say we were afraid what would happen. And after several weeks and months, the measures against the Jewish population started to bite.
Jews not wanted. Jews keep out. Even in parks, if Jews are allowed at all, special yellow benches are set apart, labeled for Jews.
She was not allowed to go into parks, she was not allowed to go to the movies, she was not allowed to use public transport.
Not theater, swimming pools, those were things which upset us children. And then we had to leave our school, and we had to wear a yellow star.
Which was a very visible measure also in terms of the persecution of the Jews.
And then they started to arrest people, especially young people, male. So it was really very scary to go even out in the street to do your shopping or anything like that. And many, many people disappeared. In 1941, many, many were arrested.
The turmoil and persecution faced by the Jews in Amsterdam was beginning to become unbearable, but it would be a letter sent to all Jewish youths which would decide the fates of both Anne and Eva.
After 2 years, in July 1942, about 10,000 young people got a call-up notice to be deported to Germany to work in German factories. My brother Heinz, who was 16 at the time, and Anne's sister Margot, and many, many others of their friends got this call-up notice. Many parents sent their young people, but they didn't end up in Germany in working in factories. They were sent to Mauthausen and just murdered there. So it was very, very difficult, but nothing, of course, what was going to follow up.
What came next would see tragedy beyond compare for Eva and Anne. Both their lives would play out to the backdrop of war and mass genocide. The takeover of Germany by the Nazi regime in 1933 and the subsequent occupation of the Rhineland, Austria, the Sudetenland, and Czechoslovakia caused much of the Jewish population to emigrate to avoid persecution. The Netherlands was one of many countries that took in Jews from persecuted areas of Europe, and both the families of Anne Frank and subsequently Eva Schloss would establish their home there. Unlike World War I, where they remained neutral, Holland would find itself a Nazi-occupied territory in 1940, and once again the Jews who had fled persecution found themselves the persecuted. Life for both Eva and Anne would become increasingly hard, but it would be a letter sent to their older siblings which would have irreversible consequences.
That was the time that my father and Otto Frank and many other parents decided they wouldn't send their children, but we would go into hiding.
Well, they tried to leave the impression that they had to leave for Switzerland, where the family of Anne's father lived.
Otto decided, because where he worked was a warehouse with rooms above.
The annex to the house was pretty much unused, so it was an empty space. These annexes, they are a common feature in Amsterdam.
There were lots of sort of staircases and rooms at the back that could be easily obscured. So he started making plans in 1942 that should there be an eventuality, the family would go into hiding. Now, it came more suddenly than he had anticipated.
After Eva's brother had received his letter, Eva's father, like Otto Frank, would decide that hiding would be the only option. Without having prepared a hiding place, Eva's family would have to seek an alternative method which would see her family divided.
We had to split up. Nobody wanted to take a family of 4. So I went with my mother, and my father and brother went to a different hiding place.
Anne Frank and her family entered the hiding place at 263 Prinsengracht on July 6, 1942. A few weeks later, the Van Pels moved in. Herman Van Pels was Otto Frank's business partner. His wife August and their son Peter all joined the Franks in the annex. The last person to enter the annex was Fritz Pfeffer, a dentist from Berlin who emigrated to the Netherlands after the Kristallnacht in 1938.
So you imagine there were, in these limited number of rooms, there were 8 people in hiding.
I think Anne's relationship with these people is very much influenced by the fact that she was 13, 14 years old. She was a young teenage girl, and with a very lively character, she really felt trapped.
I was more an outdoor child, so I found it very, very difficult to sit still day in, day out. Missed my father and my brother and my friends.
So I think the strive for freedom is very much dominant in the diary.
The living conditions in the secret annex were extremely cramped. Anne, having been forced to share a room with Fritz Pfeffer, who in the diary she refers to as Dr. Dussel, would find solace in her writing. Her writing was partly an act of catharsis, as with many teenagers, but it was also spurred on by a radio broadcast that she happened to hear on the BBC World Service.
There was radio broadcast because you were not allowed to listen to the BBC, but people did. Somebody from the Interior Minister, I believe it was, said everybody who can should write a diary about what happened to them during this occupation. It's very important for the future.
The first entries in the hiding place reflect a sort of sense of adventure and excitement. However, the boredom and tedium soon set in, followed by the fear as they heard the bombing raids.
When you read the diary, you read about all these scenes and all her emotions when it comes to her relation with the other people. She loved her father. She had kind of a difficult relationship with her mother. Her relationship with her sister, Margot, was on and off.
During the course of those 2 years, she also falls in love with Peter, the boy in the secret annex. However, towards the end of the diary, she's outgrown him, and she's concentrating more on her personal philosophy, how difficult it is to have those ideals when everything around her is crumbling.
The Germans made house searches in the apartments because they really wanted to catch every Jew. So we had a hiding place within the hiding place. The people from the resistance came and built hiding places where we could go when they came at night to search for us.
Otto had secured a loyal group of his workforce to aid the Franks in hiding. They were Miep Gies, the office administrator, Jo Kleiman and Victor Kugler, the office managers, and Otto's secretary, Beb Voskiel.
Well, the 4 employees of Otto Frank enabled them to stay here for 25 months. They provided them with food, with drinks, with books, very important for Anne.
To look after 8 people for over 2 years was an incredible burden of responsibility.
They made a choice to risk their own lives in order to save that of others.
Throughout their time in the annex, the 8 of them would often tune in to radio broadcasts to listen to the progress of the war. They were heartened to learn that on June 6, 1944, the Allied forces had landed in Normandy. More than 800,000 Allied troops entered occupied France by the end of June. which along with the Russian forces to the east would create a two-front war for the Nazis. This was the beginning of the end of World War II. The invasion was a great source of motivation to Anne and all those in hiding. They could see the light at the end of the tunnel. Otto would listen for news of the advancement and plot it on a small map of Normandy hung on the wall of the annex. Eva, however, would not hear of the Normandy landings and Allied advancement, as she and her mother Elfriede, along with her father and her brother Heinz, had been betrayed and captured in May 1944.
After 2 years, we were betrayed by a Dutch nurse who pretended she was a member of the resistance, but she was really working with the Nazis.
Unlike Eva Schloss and her family, it would be and continue to be to this day a complete mystery as to the identity of the person who betrayed the Frank family.
It was a telephone call in the morning of August the 4th, 1944, where they say that it was a woman's voice who said that there were Jews hidden in 263 Prinsengracht.
The Franks, the Van Pels and Fritz Pfeffer were all getting along with their restricted daily routine when the Dutch police and a Gestapo officer, Karl Silverbauer, entered the office and asked the staff at gunpoint to open the bookcase. They knew from the anonymous tip-off exactly what was going on in the building. They went up to the annex and all were arrested, including 2 of their helpers, Jo Kleiman and Victor Kugler. Miep Gies had managed to evade arrest. She knew that the authorities would soon be coming to clear the annex, so managed to rescue what she could. It was then she found Anne's diary. Knowing that Anne was a budding writer, she placed it safely in her desk drawer. It was there the diary remained, lying dormant, waiting to be reunited with its owner. Eva's capture had happened on May 11, 1944, her 15th birthday. They were settling down to breakfast when there was a knock at the door. The Gestapo barged in and arrested Eva and her mother and took them to the Gestapo headquarters.
We were first sent to Westerbork, which was a holding camp, and we were immediately put on a list and transported to Auschwitz.
It was in Auschwitz where Eva and her family would be kept for the duration of the war. After their capture in June, the Frank family would follow Eva's route to Westerbork work camp in the Netherlands and then east to Auschwitz.
Anne and Margot were transported to Bergen-Belsen. There was no food, it was pretty much abandoned. It was riddled with disease. So you imagine the combination of despair, of cold, of starvation and disease. It was pretty impossible to survive Bergen-Belsen.
Anne and Margot's health deteriorated rapidly in Bergen-Belsen. In March 1945, a typhus epidemic swept through the camp, and although there are no records, it is this which is believed to have killed firstly Margot Frank, and then 2 days later, Anne Frank. The real tragedy lies in that just a few weeks later, Bergen-Belsen would be liberated by British forces.
Despite German attempts to cover up, we found these in the open field. Clear-cut evidence of beatings and outright murder was on every hand. Nameless victims were numbered for records which the Germans destroyed. This was Bergen-Belsen.
Eva and her mother Elfriede, along with Otto Frank, all of whom were still in Auschwitz, would each find themselves seeing out the final days and felt the relief as the Russian troops liberated the camp. All 3 would not foresee at that time how inexplicably their lives would become linked, not to just each other, but to Anne Frank and the legacy she would leave. The lives and experience of Anne Frank and Eva Schloss had mirrored one another throughout the Nazi occupation of the Netherlands. Both had been forced to hide, and both had been betrayed, captured and sent to concentration camps. This is where the similarities end, however, as Anne Frank, along with her sister Margot, tragically perished in Bergen-Belsen just weeks before the liberation. Despite the death of her father Erich and brother Heinz, Eva and her mother both managed to survive the horrors of Auschwitz along with Otto Frank, Anne's father. As the Allied troops advanced from the west and from the east, World War II drew to a close.
We were liberated by the Russians in 27th of January 1945. And Otto Frank was liberated with us in Auschwitz, and he did the same journey as we did. We saw him several times, but there were several hundred of people.
It took him 5 months to get back to Amsterdam.
And the Germans were fighting very, very hard in Poland. So the Russians took us away from Auschwitz, and the only way we could travel was eastward, always in cattle trucks, till we ended up in Odessa. And there we waited for the end of the war. And we were, of course, very anxious to get back to Amsterdam. And in Odessa, we waited for a troop transport ship to come, which came eventually, and then we went to Marseille, and then all the way up through France to Belgium, and eventually back into Amsterdam. So from end of January till June, we were all the time traveling, really.
Otto knew that his wife Edith had passed away, but he still believed there was some hope for his 2 daughters, Anne and Margot.
But he didn't know about his 2 girls. So he always said he had great hope that they would be alive. And we, of course, as well, my father and brother.
Eva, her mother, Otto Frank and hundreds of others would sail from Odessa in the Ukraine to Marseille in southern France. From Marseille, they traveled north back to Amsterdam. They arrived in Amsterdam in June 1945, 6 months after they were liberated from Auschwitz. The Amsterdam they came back to was not the same place they had left the previous year. The threat of the Nazis was no longer there, but their occupation had taken its toll.
It had suffered a lot, of course. The last year was the hunger winter, because the Germans took everything the Dutch produced to feed their own people. And many, many thousands of Dutch people perished from starvation. So we were not well received, actually. Not because they didn't want us to come back, but because they had suffered and they didn't really know what to do with more people who needed help.
Returning to Amsterdam, Otto Frank found that his family home in the Meveda plan was no longer available.
He couldn't move back in his own apartment because other people had moved in.
He had nowhere to go. Survivors came back. It was like arriving here from another planet.
So Otto moved in with Miep Gies, who was one of the helpers. It was still around the corner from the Meveda plan.
Eva and her mother, however, found that their apartment was still there for them to move into.
We were lucky we were able to get into our own apartment, because when we came to Amsterdam, it was a furnished apartment belonging to a Christian, and she gave it back to us. And we waited for news of our family.
Finding refuge with Miep Gies, Otto Frank was still unaware of the fate of his daughters. The thought of being reunited with them kept his hopes alive.
So he went to the central station every day where people arrived from wherever they had been and whatever camp they had been, in order to look for them, in order to know about their fates or about their whereabouts.
And he came to visit everybody who was connected with Anne or Margot, and to try to find out if they knew anything. There were lists of people who were in different camps.
He appealed in a newspaper for news of his daughters, and we still have that advertisement. And then he was introduced to two women who were in Bergen-Belsen, in the same barrack as the Frank girls.
Otto Frank came to tell us as well that he had heard that both his girls had perished in Bergen-Belsen.
Eva and her mother had also been living in hope that Eric and Heinz would be found, but they would receive the same news as Otto.
In July, we got a notification from the Red Cross that both my father and brother had perished in Mauthausen several days before the American army came to liberate that camp.
Edith Frank, having witnessed her children being taken away from Auschwitz to Bergen-Belsen, died in the January of 1945. Both Anne and Margot were to die within days of each other, with Anne having to witness her older sister's death. From the 8 people who were in hiding in the annex of 263 Prinsengracht, only one survived. That was Otto Frank.
When he came first to tell us that the girls had died, he looked as if he couldn't carry on with his life.
He went back to tell Miep, and Miep went to the drawer where she'd been keeping Anne's diary, and she said to him, "Here you are, Mr. Frank. Here is the legacy of your daughter."
She went into the secret annex after those who were in hiding were captured and taken away from here, and she managed to save lots of the diary papers.
Miep knew that within a couple of days everything would be taken away.
She kept them with her until after the war, and when she learned that Anne would not return, she gave these papers, notebook sheets, to Anne's father.
Miep hadn't read it. It was Anne's private diary. Otto went into another room and quietly read it. He came out ashen-faced and said, "Miep, I never knew my daughter."
Otto and Elfriede would begin to see more of each other, offering support from their shared experiences and losses. One of the first people to hear Otto read extracts from Anne's diary was Eva.
A few days later, he came with the diary and opened the packet very carefully, and he read a few sentences, but he always burst into tears. He couldn't read it in one go, and it took him 3 weeks to read it. He told us that.
He agonized for a long time as to whether he should publish it. She wanted to be a writer. She wanted to be a published writer. But at the end of the day, it was a private diary. And she said things that were maybe not suitable for other people to read. She wasn't very nice about her mother.
Everybody told him he should publish it, and especially a history professor told him he has to publish it. It's his duty.
Otto was paying more and more visits to Eva and her mother. During these encounters, Eva would start to witness Otto's philosophy, which would be the driving force for his life's work.
And Otto came very often. My mother cooked him a meal. He was very lonely. We talked a lot, and he told me that he, who had lost everybody really, he had no hatred. He said, you know, if you hate, you'll be so miserable.
Otto Frank dedicated the rest of his life to the diary of Anne. I think what is remarkable was that he managed to do so in a very special way, not just being that a memory of what had happened and how his family had suffered, but very much as a message to young generations to build a new future.
Otto would find that global recognition would initially come from America. Firstly with a hit Broadway stage show, and then an Academy Award-winning film. Obsessions of Anne's which would seem fitting for her legacy. Otto Frank had lost everything. The hope he carried with him as he made the epic journey back to Amsterdam was soon evaporated when he heard the devastating news of the death of both his daughters, Anne and Margot. At the same time, Otto was given the diary which Miep Gies had kept. Eva Schloss with her mother would witness firsthand the rise of what would become one of the world's most regarded works of literature, one of the world's most tragic stories, and the creation of a symbol of hope and equality in the face of persecution.
I knew they liked each other, Otto and my mother, but I had no idea how close they were. I was a very difficult teenager. I didn't want to do any housework. I was quite obstinate. I was too miserable. Otto came and, they talked and he helped me a lot. Then when I finished with school, I didn't know what to do with myself. And Otto and my mother decided I should become a photographer, which I couldn't really care what I was going to do, but I agreed. So Otto said it would be good if you would go abroad for a year, which I did, to London. Otto came to visit me quite a lot and he kept an eye on me. So he already took the part a bit of a sort of stepfather.
Otto and Elfriede grew closer and closer over time and would marry in 1953. Eva received the news whilst living in London.
He said, well, your mother and me have fallen in love. And they were married for 27 years, so longer than they were married to their first spouses.
Otto had already decided that the Diary of Anne Frank must be published.
He showed it to a few people and gauged their opinions. And then a professor called Jan Romein from the University of Amsterdam read it. And he published an article in the newspaper Het Parool saying that everybody should read this diary.
It was this article that led to the first publication on June 25th, 1947.
A third of the diary was actually taken out, removed for two reasons. First of all, Otto wanted to preserve the memory of his late wife and the others in hiding from some of the not quite nice things Anne said about them. But also, the publishing company itself deemed some of the things that Anne wrote about as unsuitable.
When the diary was first published, it had not such a great impact. It was very much a book like many other books that dealt with the occupation of the Netherlands.
When the Dutch book came out, he gave it to everybody who had known Anne. He was very, very generous, of course, with it. He wanted everybody to read it.
And it was published in a time that people focused on the future. They wanted to forget about what happened here between 1940 and 1945. They had suffered a lot, and people wanted to forget about it.
In Europe, people didn't really want to talk about what had happened, about Auschwitz or anything like that. But of course, the diary is not really about this.
So only after the mid-50s, the diary became a great success.
It came out then in 1952 in America. Great difficulty finding an American publisher as well, because people said, well, who is interested in a diary of a young girl?
The publisher who picked it up in America was Doubleday. They had taken a risk as no one really knew whether there would be any interest in it. It took an article by the novelist Meyer Levine to really popularize the book.
Meyer Levine became a friend of Otto and who loved the diary. He wrote a big article in the New York Times, how wonderful it was, and it became an immediate bestseller in America.
The stage play was dramatized by Francis Goodrich and Albert Hackett and opened in the Court Theatre on Broadway on October 5th, 1955. Anne was played by Susan Strasberg. The production grew and grew in popularity, which was helped in part by the attendance of many Hollywood stars of the time. Eva witnessed its instant success.
The play was a great success in New York first, and in London, then it was translated, it was in Germany. Then a film was being made.
The film was released in 1959 to great critical and commercial acclaim. It was directed by George Stevens, and the screenplay was written also by Goodrich and Hackett. The lead of Anne Frank was played by Millie Perkins. However, it was Shelley Winters who won an Academy Award for her portrayal of August van Pels. The world wanted to know more about Anne Frank, and Otto was eager to tell her story and continue to spread her philosophy.
Many Americans came to Amsterdam and always knocked on the door of the house and wanted to see where Anne had been hiding.
It was considered a great idea to think about preserving that hiding place, but not as a museum. Otto's vision was to see Anne's legacy as one of bringing people together.
The foundation goes back to 1957 in order to purchase the house and to open it to the public, so it took 3 years to prepare it.
What he did invest his time and energy bringing together people from around the world for international student conferences.
The Anne Frank House was first a study group for young people. People from all over the world came together and they had conferences and to talk about what they can do to change the world.
The basic feature of this house is its emptiness, which was the deliberate decision of Otto Frank that this place should remain empty. It represents the absence of Anne Frank.
The success of the play, the film, and the opening of the house fueled the proliferation of readers of the original diary.
As people were getting to read the diary, particularly youngsters, they related so much to Anne, and they started writing to Mr. Frank. They saw him in the diary as a very caring person.
Having known Otto for 27 years, I can see, you know, he was really a humanitarian, and Anne, being 2 years cooped up with him, helped her a lot to become who she was.
The point of entry when you read the diary is usually your own life. When I'm inspired by Anne Frank, it's not because my life is similar to hers in any respect, and that goes for actually everyone. So it's about a book that was able to inspire people, although their lives are completely different from her life.
Through her, of course, the world is learning about what has happened, and that is, of course, very, very important.
We have her diary as a kind of silent messenger of someone who is not there anymore, and who's not there anymore because of what has been done to her.
So we have to explain to young people how dangerous it is if we are prejudiced against also human beings.
In preserving the memory of his daughter and also the act of persecution inflicted on her, Otto, through single-minded determination, managed to elevate Anne Frank from a young, talented writer, the victim of a terrible chain of events, to become not just a face, but the symbol of the Holocaust. She has also become a figure of acceptance, forgiveness, and equality. Universal themes which all human beings can relate to. Her thoughts evolved into Otto's philosophy, which today is still maintained through the Anne Frank Foundation and the Anne Frank House, reaching out to millions across the world. Behind the global popularity of her story is the diary of a young girl, an individual with her own aspirations and ideas, who happened to be caught in extraordinarily tragic circumstances.